Hello and welcome to Jesuitical. You're about to hear an interview with John Dolan, the Bishop of Phoenix. Before we get started, be sure to click that subscribe button, and for more great content from America, visit americamagazine.org.
Joining us today is the Bishop of Phoenix, John Dolan. Welcome to Jesuitical, Bishop John.
Thank you, Ashley.
Yeah, so you had the cover story of America's June issue. It was a ministry of fragility, how the church can support mental health. So we definitely want to get into that story, to your personal story. But before we get into the conversation, I wanted to kind of frame it in the question of how we should talk about sensitive issues like mental health and especially suicide, because there are more and less helpful ways to talk about these issues, and there are harmful ways to do that. And so we want to make sure we're avoiding that. So I wonder if you have any advice on how to talk about these issues in a way that doesn't increase stigma or put people at even greater risk.
Well, generally speaking, I would say talking about mental health is always a good thing. But obviously, if we can couch it in following proper, language, I think just avoiding certain levels of judgment, and not so much judgment like in cruel judgment, like you're going to hell or anything like that, but sometimes just being prematurely judging why people have mental health related issues. And sometimes it might be, well, they're just not praying hard enough, or maybe maybe they're possessed, which is a very common thing now, especially I find among priests that's something that they tend to lean toward, looking for the devil behind everything. And sometimes it may not, well, most often it isn't that. So I'd say 99.9% of the time, people who might even say that they're possessed have, maybe severe mental health related issues. So I would say that most of us as human beings, we can be oppressed at times situationally, and some are oppressed all the time, but they're not necessarily possessed. And to me, I think that's a big piece of the puzzle when we have that conversation. And my whole thing is that when we communicate, we always remind people that they have a place at the table of the Lord. They have a place in the church, and they should have a place in society. And so anytime we can remove any of those stigmas of shame or guilt related to mental health, which has no place, then the better we will be.
I think that's a good way to ground our conversation. Some rules. Now, one of the first things you did upon coming to Phoenix was create this mental health office, this mental health ministry. Why was that so important for you to do?
Well, we in San Diego, there was a director for our Office for Social Ministries, and he kind of leaned in that direction, and I can't remember why he did. Kent Peters, a very fine fellow, and again, it was not terribly funded, but he did his best to try to create this mental health ministry. It was basically a parish-based concept, so throughout the diocese, and hopefully parishes. His hope was that parishes would be able to pick these ministries up and attend to the people who were having severe mental health related issues, depression issues. They had suicide ideation. And just to let them know, hey, look, we're here for you. We want to offer something. But it was hard because there wasn't a lot of financial backing. There wasn't an opportunity to offer what we call first aid, mental health first aid classes and so on. So when I came here and someone laid on us a huge gift and basically said, where would you like this to go? Which was just like, I mean, who does that? But at any rate, that's what happened. And at that point, I just said, well, first thing that popped in my mind was mental health. So that's kind of what happened. Of course, it's near and dear to my heart because I've lost, 3 siblings through suicide and a brother-in-law as well. So that obviously was the first thing that popped in my mind at the time. And so away we went. All of a sudden, we just took off, and we have a wonderful office and a new director for this mental health ministry. And right now, we're in the phase of just training. So we're training priests, we're training deacons, we're training religious, and anyone concerned with mental health first aid, which is kind of a state-based program. And then basically we're sharpening the axe before we try to get out there and have these places of accompaniment for people in parishes. Yeah.
I did want to ask you about your personal story, because I do imagine that is a large motivation for why you wanted to open this ministry. And a few years ago, I had an opportunity to report on the Archdiocese of Chicago's ministry to people who have lost loved ones to suicide. And the big takeaway I got from there is that, this is a kind of different way of dying, and thus has a different sort of grief in the aftermath of it. And in your piece, you refer to yourself as a survivor, which is the same as all the mothers who I spoke to who lost sons to suicide spoke of themselves as survivors. So I'm wondering if you can help our listeners understand what this is like and why it's different.
Being a survivor of suicide loss, so I lost my first brother sibling when I was in 8th grade. So I had to deal with that as an 8th grader, as a youngster. And then I lost my sister and her husband when I was in the seminary, so a junior in the seminary in college. And then my younger sister, most recently last October. And so these different ages puts me in a place where my losing someone, grieving over someone who had died by suicide, those ages mean a lot. As an 8th grader, I had no idea what to do with that. My folks didn't have anything to do with it. We didn't know what to do, how to deal with that. And then my sister dying by suicide in my junior year in college, that was different. It was still hard, but it wasn't our first rodeo, sad to say. And then this one, my sister Mary dying, I guess we all sort of half expected this to happen because she had attempted multiple times. And so it wasn't a matter of if, but almost when. And I think we all kind of felt in a very weird way, kind of a sigh of relief, because I'd never met someone who wanted to die as much as she did, pretty much every day. So it's a hard thing. I miss her terribly, but it's just, and you just leave it up to God. I think you just have to turn it over to God. And
it's an incredibly difficult thing. I'm so sorry, and thank you for sharing with us. You mentioned in your piece, being able to find support from your faith and the church as you're dealing with some of this grief. But I know, and Ashley knows from her reporting, that that's not necessarily always the case. That some people, for some people, that's a place for them to turn, but other times, you mentioned there have been gaps sort of in our pastoral care for survivors of suicide. Could you, maybe both give your experience of it, and then maybe some firsthand ways you've seen some of these gaps where the church has not done so well?
Well, I think it's not a surprise to you, but I think there have been gaps in pastoral care in general.
Sure.
So, and this is just one more, segment of those gaps. But I would say, obviously, when we're going back to those words of judgment or judging prematurely, not judging the soul as much, but really judging, coming up with unexpected conclusions, or just creating these conclusions like, well, there must have been something wrong. This person didn't pray hard enough. This person's faith was waning. If they just relied on God, or if they had just gone to the sacraments and things like that.
And are you hearing these things from like families or from clergy or from?
Yes, all of the
Yes.
above.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
And what did your tragic firsthand experience? How did that inform the shortcomings of those types of judgments? Like why they're not helpful, why they're not true? What did you see that kind of undermined that approach to looking at suicide?
Well, even after my sister Mary had died by suicide, you'd get two forms of prayer. A lot of cards, really, of sympathy, and some cards were, well, most cards were, we're with you, we're praying, and we trust that God is bigger than all of this, and that she's with God. Which is good and nice. And then there were some, we're praying that she's not in hell, and they meant well, but that's like, those aren't the things you want to hear. So I think sometimes we just kind of have people maybe make some assumptions, and maybe based on their old traditional teachings that they had received, like maybe this person shouldn't be buried. Maybe that person is in hell,
Which, maybe if you could just like outline some of like, because the church has changed the way it talks about and teaches this. Could you maybe outline sort of where it was and where it is now? Because I don't think it's necessarily, even though it has changed, as you mentioned, some people are still handing down some of the old stuff.
Yes. Well, I'm a co-author of a book or a co-editor on a book with Deacon Ed Schoner. I was on a handbook for suicide survivors. So I had, we had, Cardinal Gregory, and we had Archbishop Cordileone, and they were all weighing in on this. And what was interesting, Archbishop Cordileone showed us, in his segment of this book, he shows us really what he calls a development of the human person, a development of dogma of humanity. And I said he's actually absolutely right on. We have come to see this development of the human person, especially now that we're able to look under the hood with new technology and see that, our brains are actual physical matter, and it's not a mind over matter approach that we have to take to everyday issues. Sometimes the matter itself, the physical brain matter, is so affected that our level of culpability is diminished greatly. Historically, then the church has kind of evolved to this level where now we can talk about levels of culpability, and especially as it relates to, holes in the brain and lack of blood flow and all of these different things that cause disorder.
Yeah, and this is reflected in changes in the Catechism. It used to be
correct
that suicide was always it was a morally grave sin, and the updated Catechism admits that there are circumstances that may reduce your moral culpability.
Absolutely.
And it's very interesting. You talk about how this was actually informed by science. It was the church taking into consideration what we've learned through psychiatry and MRIs and brain imaging. So it's a very interesting place where science has actually, as Archbishop Cordileone said, led to the development of dogma.
Well, it had real effects, no? Because it was the case that you wouldn't be given a Christian burial if you had died by suicide, and now church law, you mentioned in your piece, permits that. I imagine that itself had to be a huge pastoral grace for survivors.
Certainly that was. And I think our church is just moving us slowly to accept this reality that the brain is a lot deeper than we thought before. And I can't imagine how counselors, psychiatrists were able to address a person who had a mental disorder without the imaging that we have today and just in the last 30 years. So now we're able to kind of target some where certain parts of the brain are affected, and then we're able to, not me, but the psychiatrists are able to prescribe drugs that are a more perfect cocktail today than they would have in the past. They would often offer kind of a generic drug, a one size fits all, but now because of fMRIs and imaging, we're able to look at a person and see, oh, hey, we can pinpoint where the trouble is. It's really amazing.
So science and medicine have been able to inform the church's approach to mental illness. But I think what is clear from your piece is that, not that it has its limits, but it has its lanes, and then the church has its own lane. And so I want to talk about your specific ministry in Phoenix and how you recognize the church's place as opposed to the place of the medical field.
Well, the two should be walking hand in hand or driving down the same highway, maybe two different lanes, but we're driving in the same direction. And I think that's a really important thing. And sometimes religion can get a little too far ahead. And so, if they pray hard enough, then they're going to be able to deal with this. On the other hand, science can get too far ahead and say faith has no place in the field of psychiatry or the field of medicine in general. But so when they work well together, that's when we're in sync. And I believe that both, it's our age-old Catholic tradition that faith and science lead to the same end, God, ultimately.
And what specifically is the church's lane? As you're thinking, as you're, very much still getting this mental health ministry, going, what are some of the things that you're hoping to do and not do?
Right. Well, I guess specifically, the Office for Mental Health Ministry is focused on educating. Really, that's a big piece. If we can just educate people about the science today. So this mental health first aid, which is kind of a state-run program, it really gets everyone up to speed on what's going on in the world of medicine in the psychological field. And then the other is the accompaniment piece. So we don't diagnose, we don't treat, we don't prescribe. And we make that very clear for legal reasons, but also just practically, all we're trying to do is fill in the gap. So let's say a person is seeing a counselor. We're also there to kind of bring people together anyway, and just maybe on a Sunday or a weekday and with other people, and kind of offer that extra piece of spiritual care, So going back to the issue of lanes, I think they do converge, but we do know our lane. So the mental health ministry is not going to try to prescribe, or anything like that.
But maybe this ministry is able to kind of refer out even,
100%. Yeah.
Right.
And the office itself will make sure that the people that we have are properly vetted so that they are credentialed, because a lot of pastors don't know that, and they'll think, oh, this person is a counselor. Somebody raises their hand, says they're a counselor, but they're not. Or they allow their credentials to lapse, or maybe they lost their credentials. There's a whole.
Well, I mean, that's such a. I mean, so I even think how daunting it would be, if someone comes to me in my own person, whether a friend or a family member, it's like, hey, I need help. I don't know where to go. I can be like, great, me neither. I will accompany you. I will walk with you. But if I had somewhere to turn that's like, that I just knew off the top of my head because I was seeing it on church on Sunday, it's like, oh, I don't know, but they do. Let's go ask them. I mean, that's a huge, huge benefit to the people of the diocese.
And it's more than just even referring them to another counselor. It can also refer them to people in the parish. If you have a robust mental health ministry process, you can refer them to food sources like a food pantry. You can refer them to someone who might be able to assist them with, educating, taking care of their kids, babysitting services, all the different things while you're trying to just, you know, get your life together, I guess.
Yeah, you mentioned the word accompaniment, and
Mm-hmm.
you have this wonderful way of describing yourself in the article as a fragile accompanier.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that fragile part?
This is my take on life. And this covers every level, the psychological dimension, the social relational dimension, the physical dimension, the sexual dimension, our moral dimension. We're all disordered. And I go with the issue that I start with the idea that we're not a perfect people, but there's this perfect God who loves us and accepts the fact that we all start out in this disordered world. And God is always there. I came to heal the sick, not the healthy. And so if we all start from that level, then we're all going to be fragile accompaniers. If I'm pretending that I've got my act together and you don't, then I'm not going to be that great of a help. I'm going to be Pope Francis talks about spiritual direction or spiritual accompanier. And he prefers accompaniment versus direction, because direction kind of implies that you're already there and you're guiding a person to where you need to be.
You mentioned the ministry, the mental health ministry, being one of accompaniment, but that seems to be where Francis is calling the church to sort of move in general, right? Outside of any one specific ministry, is this a church of accompaniment? How do you see that overlapping with some of the other ministries happening in your diocese or in the future of the church?
Well, again, I think with the understanding that we're all disordered, if we all start from that level, then we should just be accompanying everyone. Accompanying the stranger. We're in a border state, so we accompany the migrant. We accompany people who are just trying to eke out a living. I'm in a diocese where it's one of the largest counties and fastest growing counties in the nation. And with that comes a great deal of poverty, people living on the streets. How are we accompanying the people living on the streets? So Catholic Charities, St. Vincent de Paul, we have a magnificent St. Vincent de Paul program here. It's just huge. It's great. And it touches every parish. It's really wonderful. So I really think that accompaniment is exactly where we need to be. We're losing people in our churches because we're not. We're focused more on dogmatic teaching rather than just giving a glass of water to somebody here in the desert of Phoenix. That's where the teaching should begin.
Yeah, and I think some people would be more comfortable or used to a language of service as opposed to accompaniment, because it implies like I have something to give you. You need my help.
Right. And in some ways, I'm okay with that. If people are ready and willing to roll up their sleeves and do something for another, I think that's probably a very good start. Um, but
But do you see a distinction there?
Yes, I do. Again, because it can come from that level of I've got these goods and I'm going to give it to you, and don't somehow that feeds my soul because I did something good, but I still don't see you. I haven't embraced you. I haven't accompanied you. I haven't looked at you as a friend in the manner of Jesus, who did that. He walked with people. He dined with sinners. That's what he did. And he knew them by name, you know, and that's what we should be doing, looking at the person.
That is a Pope Francis quote right there, seeing the person. And
Right.
a lot of people are very on board with that, but some people, particularly here in the United States, are also a little skeptical or resistant to some of that change, right? I mean, some of that is just conversion is hard and painful, and other parts there are like sharp and real disagreements with the program. Are you noticing that in your own diocese, or how do you navigate that? How do you sort of be a bishop of all people then?
Yeah, on occasion, I had some people who would just try to shut this whole thing down. They would just say, I don't believe in this. I don't believe in psychiatry or psychology. I think we can just, and we'd get letters, I'd get letters saying baptism and the sacraments, that's all that matters, Well, in many ways, it is true, because if God is not embedded in our society, particularly through our sacramental life, then we should just close up shop. If we can just keep educating, and just be a mouthpiece for this, for the people in the world of psychology, the psychiatrists, the psychologists, they're loving it, that the Catholic Church is actually responding to their field of medicine, and they see it because it gives Catholics permission to seek out a counselor, to seek out a psychiatrist if necessary. So the more we talk about it, I think it's just going to get better. And speaking to the priests, especially, and the deacons, who, they have a microphone every Sunday. And if you can give them that level of sensitivity and open their hearts to really understand the human person before they focus on the moral issues. The moral issues are there, just because a person has a diminished capacity or a level of culpability doesn't mean that they can
getting off scot-free.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's something I have struggled with reporting on this, is the tension between not judging, not stigmatizing, but also not normalizing and ignoring the real pain that suicide and other things can cause in the lives of people around them. So how do you deal with that tension in your ministry?
I always like to start with, people might walk away from our moral precepts or our laws or our rule of life. So my challenge is then tell me, what is your rule of life? And let's see if you can even abide by that. And so then you start celebrating those little benchmarks where they are, and then walk with them as they might expand that rule of life to include, better relationships with their families, better relationship with God, better relationship with the church, and so on. But you start where a person is. You don't let them off, and you celebrate their rule of life as they see it right now. And then, if possible, expand that, but at least keep them consistent. And so sometimes you see that with people who struggle with mental health, and you celebrate what they do have. And that might take months or years. And then you add on to that, have you noticed that you do reach out to family on occasion? Let's celebrate that. And you start to expand that rule of life. And maybe it gets to a place where they can fully accept a lot of the things that we have within our church. But you just take them where they are. So,
Bishop John, want to say thank you for all of the work you've done in getting this ministry started, for the essay you wrote in America, and for joining us today. But before we let you go, we do have one final question for you that we ask all of our guests, which is, if you could canonize one person, living or dead, fictional or real, Catholic or not, who would it be and why?
Well, I would say one is on his way, I'm hoping. John Paul actually made him a blessed for sure. Blessed Fra Angelico. He's an early Renaissance painter. And what I liked about him was that he was able to take a point perspective, a linear perspective that hadn't been a part of the church or the art up until that point, And then he was able to employ a theological expression of that as well. So it wasn't just using the mathematical technology of 3D effect, but he was able to kind of create a theological 3D effect, which I think is exactly what we need today when we're thinking about the world in which we're living. We need to look at things from a different perspective.
Maybe a fourth dimension.
Do you have a favorite painting that you can point people to?
Well, of his, it's Our Lady of Cortona. And there's, you'll see in the very back, upper left-hand corner is Adam and Eve being ushered out of the garden. And up in the front of the painting is the angel Gabriel speaking to Mary. So you get salvation history, not from a left to right, but from a 3D perspective, which is pretty cool.
Yeah. Well, that's a new one for us, I think. Saint Fra Angelico.
Yeah.
Bishop Dolan, once again, the essay is A Ministry of Human Fragility, Why I Established a Mental Health Office in the Diocese of Phoenix. We're going to link to that in our show notes so people can read it. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
My pleasure. Thank you, too.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to check out Bishop Dolan's essay at americamagazine.org. And the best way to support our work is with a digital subscription to America. You can do that at americamagazine.org/subscribe.